Welcome to the Daily Slant, powered by ProFootballFocus and brought to you by Draftkings.com. I'm your host, Josh Hayes, joined by my co-host, Renee Miller. You can find Renee Miller's work here at ProFootballFocus.com, along with ESPN, RotoWorld, and you can follow her on Twitter at ReneeMiller01. You can also follow me on Twitter at JoshHayesFS. Renee, welcome to Week 3.
Welcome to Week 3, Josh. It's good to be here.
All right, well, just for starters here, quick update for you. Still no contact from Mike Clay about the projection business there. Maybe it's for good reason now after you saw some of my Week 2 lineups there with Drew Brees in there and Tevin Coleman and Ameer Abdullah. So if you did some fact checking, this week it's for good reason. Last week, decent record. This week, I think I'm going to have to put a little bit more of a higher score up here in order to sort of justify my future position as assistant projection manager for Pro Football Focus. So we'll get working on that here. Coming up on today's show, we'll talk about adjustments that we plan on making into Week 3. We'll talk about some pricing adjustments and some prize pool adjustments that are happening across the various sites, with all the big players. Well, I have an interesting Twitter question that we'll get to in terms of late swap adjustments. That you can that may matter for cash games and I guess for GPPs as well. And then we'll break down our Week 3 lineups by position going into this weekend here. So quick question for you here. After knowing what we know with Week 2, anything specifically that stands out to you that you plan on adjusting lineup wise or I guess lineup building wise going into this week?
In a lot of ways, we had a Week 2 that was the diabolical opposite of Week 1. Players that went off in Week 1 really disappointed us in Week 2 and vice versa. Guys we gave up on too quickly, rounded back into form. And I think that the only take-home message is to continue to do the work, not to overreact. Are there concerns with a player like CJ Anderson? Yes. I think that it's time to worry about a player like CJ Anderson in all formats. And, if you drafted him probably in round 2 in your season-long leagues. And I know I didn't use him in Week 2 DFS, but got burned once, and that'll be enough for me. I think we can start to understand some trends, which obviously the Patriots have not taken the step back that a lot of people thought they might, even with the reversal of Tom Brady's suspension. I think a lot of people thought the AFC East was going to be a much tighter battle, and clearly the Patriots are still head and shoulders above everyone else in that division. The Colts maybe in a bad enough division that they're still viable team football wise, but their fantasy prospects are certainly falling well short of what we expected. Those, I guess, are the two things that I'll probably build off of the most going forward. Everything else, I'm still very much in a state of flux. Like, I'm still in wait and see mode on most of the NFL. And obviously you have to march forward, but I'm not reaching any dire conclusions in one direction or another on most players.
That brings me to a question that I'll probably just jump to here in a second, since we're right there on top of the topic. Quickly, I want to touch on what you said here with the Colts. The interesting part that fantasy owners are in is that I think a lot of people, or maybe some of the newer people to DFS, were thinking, okay, 2 straight weeks of duds from Andrew Luck, and another meh performance from Frank Gore. Not a lot of production from Andre Johnson. T.Y. Hilton obviously wasn't a great matchup for him, and we saw Dante Moncrief continue to bust out. But pretty much you're getting flat pricing for Colts going into Week 3 because they played Monday night and because the games were already released. So that's something to keep in mind, and that might actually be a good point of contention for people who want to play the Colts in Week 3 and Andrew Luck, because I do, and I was sort of hoping for a discount, but it might actually be to my benefit, your benefit, everyone else's benefit that they didn't price adjust, because it's probably going to lead to a lower ownership percentage when they see that they go into their game from set lineups later on this week and there is no discount for Andrew Luck. So will you be having some shares of Andrew Luck here in Week 3?
Probably not. There's just other quarterbacks that I like a lot better. They're back on the road this week. He he just didn't look good. Obviously I watched the game, and he was not the robotic, automatic Andrew Luck that he has been. And yes, he was, he made some mistakes last year, but they were so few and far between, his amazing plays, his amazing throws, that, you could overlook them. That's harder to overlook right now. And the matchup is great this week, even though it is on the road. I'll probably take my Colts exposure in the form of Dante Moncrief only.
That makes sense to me. And
I understand.
The difference for me here is that, when if you feel like you're getting like a huge number of value plays, and I think every week, we talked about this last week, that the prices are going to start to shrink and shrink and shrink on bona fide starters that are priced at near minimum salary. It's going to be tougher to justify paying up for a top quarterback option when you don't feel comfortable about his level of production. So there's two sides of it. I think I want a little bit of exposure for Andrew Luck because I think that Tennessee is going to be a pretty strong matchup for him in terms of ability to bounce back, but you're just having to pay top dollar, so you're gonna have to feel great about the surrounding lineup behind that. So
I like sort of strategy overall. It was a winning one for me in week 2. With the likes of Joe Flacco, who was kind of my bounce back candidate of the week, and that was a great usage of the bounce back strategy. So I certainly understand it.
All right, yeah, and that's something that Jonathan Bales talked about in his book, I think, Fantasy Football for Dummies, too. So I like sort of trying to take that angle if you feel comfortable with the rest of your lineup. And I'll see how comfortable I feel after we have the professor grade my lineup that I feel comfortable with this week. So we'll talk about it here. But this is the question that I want to jump to here before we get to our Twitter question for today. Is 2 weeks too soon to give weight to the 2015 stats? I think a lot of people want to feel like they know who's good, who's a good defense, who's a bad defense, or maybe they feel like they don't know anything after the amount of upsets that happened here in week 2. Where do you stand, and how much data do we need?
I mean, you have to look at all the data. You certainly can't ignore what's happened in 2 weeks. It's 1/8 of the season, or nearly 1/8 of the season. And I think what I've been doing in doing research for week 3 and deciding, the players that I want in my lineups, the players that I'm going to write about in my articles this week, is to kind of look for continuations. So what did we see in 2014 that's continuing in 2015, that's consistent? And that's kind of where I'm looking right now. I'm a little more wary of big turnarounds in either offense or defense. Because I think that can be a little bit more circumstantial. So I think putting the 2 weeks that we have in the context of a bigger time window is the way I'm going about it. I'm not ignoring the 2 weeks at all, and especially if there's reasons that the Jets secondary is better this year because they got Revis back, then obviously that's something that's going to continue. And But I think having a bigger context and understanding how 2015 fits into 2014, or even going back 2013 for some offensive players that we know the roles very well.
Yeah, and I think that's a strong point. And if you're taking a look at ProFootballFocus.com in the signature stats section, it's fairly easy for you to flip to the 2014 grades overall by pass defense, pass rush, rushing defense there, and you can sort of see, okay, is Baltimore still stout against the run like they were in 2014 versus their grades for 2015? So you can sort of fairly quickly match those up. Speaking of the stats too, I just want to give a quick shout and credit to the fine guys at Pro Football Focus putting together the wide receiver cornerback chart. And if you're not using that, you're basically doing it wrong right now. Eric Decker was one of the top graded players there that a lot of people didn't feel necessarily comfortable with. Just, I guess, on name recognition. For me, I had no problem rolling him into my lineup, especially given the price. He was right there in that mid-range, a little bit cheaper than Julian Edelman. And he paid big dividends there. And he was one of the that had, one of the highest rated advantages. And it's so easy to sort. You can just basically click on the advantage column and sort by green there and take a look at some of the top options. Just for example, today, going into week 3, Travis Benjamin has, I think, the top grade in this quarterback wide receiver cornerback matchup heading into week 3. So I'll get your take on that here in a few moments, but I don't want to forget about this guy's Twitter question here before we move along. So we had his question sent in from @EmpireFFL. And just to basically summarize, he asked, is it prudent to late swap into a potentially higher percentage owned player to protect the lead on Monday night? If that makes sense. So basically, I think what's happening is he's in a 50-50 matchup. Let's say that he had, in his example in week 1, he had Adrian Peterson, and he could have swapped to Carlos Hyde, which was a cheaper value. And I think he could have. I think he was wary that there was a higher percentage of people playing Carlos Hyde, and it bumped him out of the money. Is basically what happened. So does that make sense to you? I feel two ways about it overall. I think I have to go with a higher projected player in most spots, but I see your point.
I agree. That's really easy to say in hindsight, but nobody on Monday night, I mean, you could have pulled 1,000 fantasy players and 10 of them would have said that they expected Carlos Hyde to outscore Adrian Peterson in that game. So I think using hindsight, well, duh, of course, you should have swapped for Carlos Hyde. But in the absence of that, 2020 hindsight vision, Adrian Peterson is the right play because he's the highest projected player. And honestly, you expected his ownership to be relatively high as well. I would have, I thought around 15% at least in 50-50 contests. So in the case where it's a cash game play where you think that you have, if you have the Carlos Hyde and you could swap to, I don't know, maybe say in week 3, it's Carlos Hyde and Chris Ivory, and you feel like Chris Ivory is likely to be the higher owned player with, a plus matchup and the safer player, then I would switch to maybe the safer player that I thought was going to be higher owned. But I would never switch in a cash game. I would never do the Carlos Hyde for Adrian Peterson swap.
That makes sense. And I think there's actually a way to sniff this out a bit because for instance, I guess in a perfect example, you could play a Thursday game with a lineup lock on FanDuel and have the percentages in there and have that potential swap option in your DraftKings lineup heading into Monday night, and you could see the percentages that are available in your GPP or your cash games on the FanDuel lineup and sort of project that over towards DraftKings. Now, it's not a great way, it's not a foolproof way to do it because the prices are different, but I think you can give you an idea as to whether you need to protect yourself or not. I'm probably not going to overthink it too much. Is the way I'm going to approach it. If I feel like I played the highest projected player, and that guy still is going to give me a best chance to win, then, probably in most cases, I would have already played Chris Ivory rather than Carlos Hyde if I felt like that was the best play to begin with. So are we on the same page here with that?
Yep. But many people will try to spend down to their last dollar. So maybe they thought Chris Ivory was the best play. They put him in the lineup, and then they realize they have $1,200 left and they can upgrade to Carlos Hyde, so they'll do it. And that's just the way we are. We don't like to leave those dollars on the table, even if we suspect or have a hint that we might be downgrading our optimal. There's some little part of us that said it's never optimal to leave money on the table.
Right. It's just like shopping at Walmart or Whole Foods. You're like, I know if I spend more money at Whole Foods, I'm obviously getting better food, right?
I'm going to live longer.
You're probably right. Yeah, it is. In that case, you're probably doing the right thing. Yeah. Maybe that's just a bad example, but yeah, just in everything, in society in general, I think whenever you feel like you're spending more money, you automatically expect greater value, and that is not necessarily the case. You have to break away from that. Yep. In DFS. So we're going to try to keep hammering that point home. So before we move on to our lineup breakdown for week 3, we want to let you know that football is back, if you didn't know by now, and it already feels like the playoffs thanks to the 1 week fantasy games here at DraftKings.com. With millions being won each week, every play in every game could take you closer to a life-changing payday. This isn't fantasy as usual. This is DraftKings. Welcome to the big time. Hurry to DraftKings.com now and use the promo code PFF to play for free in your first deposit in this Sunday's $1 million fantasy football contest. That's the code PFF for a free entry now at DraftKings.com. That's DraftKings.com. And along with that first deposit, by the way, using the PFF code, you get access to Fantasy Gold on Pro Football Focus, will help you set awesome lineups. And Renee and I are using a lot of those signature stats each and every week in our articles and our lineups as well. So you're getting great data for you to compete in your DraftKings.com lineups once you make that deposit. All right, positional breakdown time here, Renee. Let's go ahead and kick it off with the quarterback position like we have the past couple of weeks here. Who piques your interest under center?
I mean, I think that there's a couple, I don't know, maybe there's three guys that I'm kind of focused in on heavily at this point in the week. This is early in the week. Tom Brady tops that list. I think he's probably your safest quarterback play this week at home versus Jacksonville. The spread is huge in this game. The Patriots are favored by almost 2 touchdowns. We've seen that Tom Brady is relentless in his pursuit of excellence as usual. The spread doesn't scare me off here. The Patriots aren't the kind of team to try to stop scoring points when they have a lead. They will continue to push and continue to score. I mean, we even saw it last week when, at the end of the Bills game, clearly they could have run, and they're still throwing. They're still throwing for the end zone. They want those points. They want those stats. So Tom Brady is the easy top option for me this week.
Yeah, and you definitely love the cost savings over. Well, actually, the cost saving isn't nearly as big as you want it to be. Actually, particularly on DraftKings, it's $7,700 versus $8K for Aaron Rodgers, which is also probably a great cash game play. I think I'm going to lean when we get to this point every week here. That $300 doesn't sound like a ton, but it could be the difference between a second and a third tier wide receiver or flex play. So I'm definitely interested in taking the cost savings, particularly against Jacksonville. I love the famous line by Bill Belichick a few years back when he asked. I think they put up like 55 points in the snow game, and he was asked why they were continuing to pass in the fourth quarter, and he said, "Well, what happens if we get an interception and they return it for a touchdown? Now with 4 minutes left, we're only up 3 scores." I was like, "You're right, Bill. Who feels comfortable about a 21-point lead with 4 minutes left, especially when you get the ball back?" Sorry, bad question. Let's move on.
I mean, they just like to dominate.
Yeah, you know what? And it's great for fantasy too. You feel very good when you have Tom Brady, Gronk, and for instance, Julian Edelman. I had a few shares of him last week. I wish I had more, obviously, in my lineup there. And it makes for an interesting case too here. So we're moving off of quarterbacks for a bit second, and we'll jump right back. But in your hookup here, do you want Gronk? Do you try to fit Edelman here as well? Do you think you can justify paying all 3? And will your lineup make sense still if you have that much of a stack?
I think in some cases it's okay to have all 3. And otherwise it's a toss-up. I'll have equal amounts of Edelman and Gronk. Probably, that's how I'll do it mostly. But a little bit of all 3 is probably going to be okay.
All right. Now, the next question, too, related to this is Dion Lewis, who had another fine fantasy game. People thought that LeGarrette Blount was going to steal some carries. And now we're sort of concerned a little bit about the whole game script formula that we've sort of known the Patriots to abide by, because they didn't give – not that you should have ran on Buffalo, given their defense there, but we sort of thought that at least, we would have saw a few carries more than what LeGarrette Blount got in week 2. So are we just locked and loaded with Dion Lewis as the primary back to own here in going forward for the Patriots?
First, I think the only thing that we know about predicting the Patriots game script is that as far as running backs are concerned, is that it won't go the way we think.
Exactly.
Dion Lewis seems to have the favor, but again, this is the case. He could have these 2 amazing games, do no wrong. Well, he did a little wrong, but up for that. And he could not touch the ball this week versus Jacksonville, just because Jacksonville has prepped for him all week, no doubt. So it could be a heavy dose of LeGarrette Blount, either because the lead is so big that they do eventually try to run the ball to run the clock out, or just because Bill Belichick is going to do something different and run a different offense than we've seen the first 2 weeks to keep Jacksonville on their toes.
I actually have it like a Bible script up on my wall here. Maybe I should have faced it towards the camera, but it says, 2014 Jonas Gray. Let us never forget. So, you can go from outhouse to penthouse in a heartbeat. Everyone thought, I think people were in season-long leagues were blowing their entire fab on Jonas Gray. They're like, oh, Patriots new bell cow back. This guy's amazing. Or he's inactive the very next week for missing practice. So, yes, definitely going to subscribe to that there. Having said that, for 4,200 on DraftKings for Dion Lewis, I'm going to feel pretty comfortable with him as a flex play, provided I'm not too overexposed with a lineup that has both Edelman and Gronk. I don't think I want all three, although all three did pay dividends here in week 2, but I don't expect that to be the case from week to week.
Okay.
All right, so quarterbacks here. Aaron Rodgers is the top priced option there. Is he number 2 for you? Is he still a viable cash game option? Will there be an opportunity for you to split action with Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady, or do you feel like you anchor your 50-50s and any of your cash with Tom Brady, and then everything else is sort of GPP related?
No, Aaron Rodgers is a fine play this week. He doesn't stand out as a top play, but it's very hard to ever make an argument against him. He's very safe. The only argument is that you're paying the most money for him. Another guy that I do like a lot is Russell Wilson, who you don't think of necessarily maybe for cash games, but the Seahawks are 0-2 heading into their home opener. And I think that the proper adjustments will be made on this football team. And I think that benefits Jimmy Graham, and I think that definitely benefits Russell Wilson. I like them both a lot in week 3.
Yeah, I think I'll definitely have a few shares of that hookup there as well. Now, should we consider Doug Baldwin at all after his first couple week performance there? And does it make enough sense to have all 3 in that lineup, or is it sort of you subscribe to the same sort of theory with Tom Brady, Edelman, and Gronk? You split it?
I split it. I think Doug Baldwin is your cash game guy. He's going to lead the team in targets probably and yards, but I think and I hope that the Seahawks are going to look for Jimmy Graham in the end zone. I think Jimmy Graham is going to have the touchdown, hopefully, and but Doug Baldwin will be the move the chains downfield guy. Yeah,
and I'd love excuse me. I almost said Where's Waldo? Doug Baldwin for 4K on DraftKings. Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a perfect way in your cash games to get to an Antonio Brown, to get to a Julio Jones while using Russell Wilson. $1,000 cost savings off of Aaron Rodgers is pretty interesting for me as well. Is it good enough of a matchup and a cost savings to justify Wilson in cash, or should we just leave that for GPPs?
I think it is. They're at home. The Bears are pretty weak. By either PFF's grades or ESPN's fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks and receivers, the Bears are definitely bottom below average in both categories. So I think they're safe. I think Russell Wilson is safe enough for cash games. He's got the running floor, the rushing yards that boost his floor every week, and that has always been a bigger part of his game, I think, when they're in Seattle.
All right, I'm going to give you a lot of credit here for being on Larry Fitzgerald before anybody else that I talked to here coming into the season. There, great performance for him as well. He is grading out number 2 behind Travis Benjamin here in terms of advantage plays for just referring back to the wide receiver cornerback chart here on ProFootballFocus.com. Under the Fantasy Hub, by the way, for those of you who haven't checked that out yet. So make sure you do so there. Carson to Fitz, week 3 here against San Francisco. GPP all day for you here?
I think temper your expectations, and maybe, I don't think we're going to see that kind of 3 touchdown performance every week.
Right.
But clearly the chemistry is there. When Carson Palmer is healthy, he's always an option. He started last season this way, and you think what might have been. But as Michael Floyd continues to get healthy and John Brown is still part of the offense, I don't think it'll be all Larry Fitzgerald every week. I think if he'll start to get more defensive attention after the week 2 performance, and it could open some things up for the younger guys.
All right, I like that there, and I think at 6,600, for instance, on DraftKings, it makes a lot of sense, and it's going to give you some extra flexibility spending down the quarterback position while still feeling like you're going to get a high level of production there as well. The only thing that was sort of, I don't want to say disappointing, because he had a great fantasy game overall, is that there was so much damage done, like in the kickoff returns, and the yardage just didn't match up with the total touchdowns that were thrown by Carson Palmer. But you really are nitpicking if you're starting to complain about that with his performance there in week 2.
Touchdown day.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like the typical like never satisfied DFS player. They're like, why doesn't he have 440 yards like Derek Carr?
Right.
Okay, so Phillip Rivers here, another interesting option for me on the road at Minnesota. It was serviceable here in week 2, held his own against a tough matchup on the road at Cincy. Does he make any sense here for a GPP in week 3?
He probably does. He hasn't caught my attention really. I haven't looked into the matchup a lot. I've more focused on I really like the value of the running game in San Diego, but yeah, Phillip Rivers is he's one of those guys, like, I mean, I just said it, he didn't catch my attention. He doesn't catch people's attention. He's just kind of flies under the radar and always does a good job.
Right.
I mean, almost always does a good job. But yeah, I mean, hopefully we see more Keenan Allen this week. That'll certainly help him. And like Ladarius Green has finally been who we thought he would be going back to this time last year, honestly. So he's got the weapons, and even though it's a road matchup, he's solid.
I'm a little bit surprised that DraftKings hasn't price adjusted for Stevie Johnson the way that I thought after 2 consecutive weeks, because he became like almost an automatic wide receiver 3 play once I rolled my lineups and I got like my 2 top studs. If I spent down at running back and I made room for Odell Beckham Jr. and Antonio Brown, which I tried to do, or Julio Jones, like some sort of that combo there. And a lot of my lineups there, I was like, all right, Stevie Johnson for 4,300, or, it was between that and I think John Brown was in that same range. And you definitely made a little bit more, I guess, hay with Stevie Johnson with another touchdown there. But this is 2 straight weeks where he's seemed to be just hooked up and dialed in with Phillip Rivers here. So are you going to be having a good amount of shares of Stevie Johnson for week 3?
Yeah, I don't mind Stevie Johnson. He's a fine value receiver. Yeah, no problem with it at all. Yeah, I mean, right. He was somebody that I liked in the preseason, and I think he's kind of met expectations. I don't think that the ceiling is outrageous, but I think the floor is fairly safe for him.
I think this is somebody, just as an example, that should be priced somewhere near the $6K range, I guess, on DraftKings rather than 4,300. So I'll be trying to. Yeah,
I wouldn't pay more than 5.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we'll call it even, split it down the middle there, and we'll say 5.
And so we're getting a discount from both perspectives.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so my next question for you two here is let's talk about some deep league or deep DFS options here, going for the home run play. I'm going to give you a few names, and then you tell me who tops this list for you, or who stands out, or somebody you're like, never would, not touching him with a 10-foot pole. Okay, we have Derek Carr at 5,300, but it is on the road at Cleveland, who just gave Marcus Mariota a handful. Kirk Cousins for 5,500 on the road at the New York Giants. There, they've had a good amount of passing yards. Then you have Johnny Manziel, 5,100 at home against Oakland. And the last person I want to mention here, Nick Foles for 5,200 at home against Pittsburgh. These are all DraftKings prices, by the way. Yep.
Nick Foles is by leaps and bounds, my favorite play there. He's been like, I think I might have even said this on the show last week that, like, I don't know how he did it. But but he ended up with good fantasy numbers. And he did it again. And this week he gets Pittsburgh secondary, who has just looked clueless. And it's interesting because it doesn't matter when Ben Roethlisberger and Antonio Brown and now Le'Veon Bell is back there. It just doesn't almost matter what the defense does because the offense is so strong. That's how they're going to win games, and they know it. And that exposes some opportunity for opponents that are likely playing from behind. And Nick Foles has had the kind of right combination of competence and this week matchup that at his price, I don't think you can ignore him at all. I'll have lots of shares of Nick Foles. The second guy.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I want to hear the guy here.
Foles.
I want to hear your second guy. Go ahead.
My second guy of the bunch is Kirk Cousins. And I don't play a lot of Thursday games. I play the primetime slate Thursday night, Sunday night, Monday night. And I have Kirk Cousins in those lineups and in Monday, Thursday lineups that started yesterday. I like the matchup here. I like the price is certainly right, and he's been an effective game manager. I don't think the upside is incredible, but with Pierre Garçon and Jordan Reed, or Reed is I don't know his status yet, but
he did get through that game, and he had another good performance there. I think it was 6 for 84, no touchdowns, but led the team in catches and yards there for week 2. So I think the clear favorite target. It's basically almost like he's the Redskins wide receiver 1, but at the tight end position. So.
Yeah. So Cousins makes my list second there. I don't know that. There's some talk that McCown might start in Cleveland, so right. I'll hold off judgment on Johnny Football until we know for sure who the starter is. And who was the last one you said? Mallet?
Not Mallet. Let me flip back because I was getting ready for running backs here. Let's see here. Derek Carr, 5,300 on Draftkings.
Derek Carr is interesting. We knew going into the season that he was going to run a high-paced offense, lots of passing attempts, and that has certainly borne out. I actually like Latavius Murray a lot this week as well against Cleveland's run defense, which I think is a lot softer than their pass defense. So Derek Carr probably has a little bit more of an uphill battle than I see either of the other two guys I mentioned having, but sure, high upside.
Okay, so speaking of McCown, how many of your GPPs are going to be loaded with Luke McCown here in week 3 if Drew Brees sits? I'm going to take the over on 50.
You're going to take what?
I was going to guess 50 of the. You're going to have like 50 shares of Luke McCown here in week 3, right? I mean, he's the better McCown of the bunch, clearly. Right? There's 3 of them.
Established my conservative nature and maybe IQ. I don't mind being wrong on Luke McCown. I won't own him.
Okay, fair enough. Just taking a shot in the dark there. All right, so let's talk about some running backs here. Who's going to be anchoring some of your lineups here at the running back position?
Man, anchoring is tough this week. There's no one that I fully trust 100%, every format, every site, every price range. I know for some people that answer is Le'Veon Bell, and that's okay. But you're basically playing top dollar, and Pittsburgh has pretty much shown us what it can do without Le'Veon Bell. In what should be somewhat easy passing matchup, I don't think that I'm going to go all in on Le'Veon Bell, though obviously his upside is sufficient to have some exposure. You get tough matchups with Lynch and Charles and Charles and Forte and Jeremy Hill, who are guys that I normally like, especially on DraftKings PPR scoring. So if I had to go all in, I guess it would be either Adrian Peterson or Marshawn Lynch at the top end, at the high end running back. Although there's been some, unevenness there, some questionable volume and production on the volume. So I know Lynch is going home for the first time. That should help him a lot. I bought in pretty heavily to him in week 2.
We had the Fred Jackson touchdown vulture, by the way, in the red zone too, which didn't help Lynch's matters there as well. So I think we're going to see like a small, bigger than expected amount of that, given that they have a more solid handcuff running back or good handy red zone threat who can catch the ball like Fred Jackson. So I'm not going to like overvalue it, but we're going to have to just sort of frown upon that, like 4 or 5 times a season here this year, I believe.
Agree. Yep. He did it in Buffalo. It's kind of what he does. And it's what made Buffalo fans love him, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I'm a huge Fred Jackson fan, so it's great to see him have success, but also I'd probably a little bit of a downer, a little bit for Marshawn Lynch owners here. Something that stood out to me when going through the lineup optimizer that we have at ProFootballFocus.com is that Devonta Freeman across all three sites, $18 on Fan on Yahoo. Let's see here, flipping two running backs there. 6,500. He's basically priced well below 6,500 on FanDuel. I believe 40. Yeah, on DraftKings, 4,600. So a supreme value across every site, plus matchup there. Do you feel comfortable enough, even though he hasn't exactly got it going here in the first couple weeks, to use him in a fair share of lineups?
I do. He's better known as a pass catching back, and he's been a lot more successful as a receiving running back this year. I think he's averaging only 2 yards per carry on the ground. I don't know that changes when the game plan calls for him to be the primary ball handler, to be a 3-down back. If his production as a pure runner will change, or if they will just change the game plan so that he's even more involved in the passing game than he has been already. But either way, sure, he's somebody that you have to have on your radar. I was going to say, following up to the fact that a lot of the top options don't have great matchups, I will probably be going value for both of my running back spots, and Freeman is definitely one of those guys that I'll be using a lot of.
Yeah, I totally agree. Oh, really? Interesting. Okay. I still have been waiting for Duke Johnson to sort of break out, and he had like 2 or 3 runs in that game where he got shoelaced like 9 yards into the second level there. So I still think there's a potential breakout situation coming out here, but and
he's a nice contrarian play to Crowell, but some part of the Cleveland running game I think should be essential part of your lineup. Oakland is terrible against the run, has been for a long time, and the quarterback situation in Cleveland is frankly up in the air. I mean, it can't be good for the team mindset and practice to be undecided at this point and to be going back and forth. And I mean, what Josh McCown is. You drafted Johnny Manziel. That's where the team should be going. They should be committing to Manziel, and they're not. And I just think it's going to lead to a heavier reliance on the run game this week, particularly given that that's where Oakland is exploitable.
I think maybe it may come down to roster construction too here, because you're getting a significant cost savings on DraftKings, for example, with Duke Johnson at 3,400, and I believe Crowell's priced at 4,500. So they're still, both of them are supreme values there as well. But if I had to choose one, regardless of price here, I think I'm going to go with Crowell, because I think he is the actual preferred red zone back there as well, and he is a starter. And through 2 weeks, I believe he is still out touching Duke Johnson there. So much more of a home run play, but I'm going to lean with you here with Isaiah Crowell there as well. And I think I'm going to subscribe to your strategy here in week 2 with value running backs. And I sort of tried to implement that, with the exception of Adrian Peterson there in week 2. I jumped back in there and pretty disappointed with the 2 goal line fumbles that cost a lot of fantasy points for people. But I think it's clear to see that Adrian Peterson's going to be back in basically that similar role there for going forward. No, not too much concern after what happened here in week 1. Now, if we're going to do that, we have a bunch of second-tier running backs in this group here that make some sense that you can sort of take advantage of here, and sort of, I think Jamal Charles to me is going to be a safe option at 7,400. Aside from that, I have concerns about a lot of these running backs there in the middle, particularly like CJ Anderson and Justin Forsett, who's gotten off to a rough start. But Chris
nice
Ivory. Sorry,
it's worth mentioning that it's a nice matchup for Justin Forsett.
Okay. You feel like he bounces back here against?
I don't feel great about him, but I think that if I had to pick a bounce back candidate, he would be it.
Okay. All right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was a little bit off of him after having a good number of shares against the Raiders for him and just not getting the level of production you have. So I will definitely take a second look here. But 2 guys I want to mention here. First of all, let's just state the obvious here. If Eddie Lacy is out, you have to lock in James Starks at minimum salary for $3K.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Almost.
And
Are you saying 100% exposure? Can we say that? Or yeah. Every lineup for me will have James Starks at minimum salary if Eddie Lacy is ruled out. So let's start there. Now, going up here a little bit higher in terms of pricing tiers, Ameer Abdullah, terrible performance here in week 2. Are you off the Ameer Abdullah train here at Denver in a tough defensive matchup? 4,500 on DraftKings?
I don't mind being the black sheep here and saying I've never been on the Abdullah train. Just haven't.
I have, and I want a refund. So
I know. That ride went to a dark place.
It did. I felt like I bought a ticket that went somewhere I didn't ever expect to go. Very disappointing. I feel like I had like over 60% exposure to Abdullah because I felt like he was on the verge of just winning that job. And I bought into the coach speak, and I'm mad at myself for doing that because Jim Caldwell was like, very vague and coy as to how much Abdullah is going to touch the ball this week, and when we all knew clearly that Joique Bell looked like a shell of him former self in 2014. So everything looked to me, especially with what Carlos Hyde did against Minnesota in week 1, to be a great value play. And now I need him to sort of rebuild some value before I can put him back into my lineup. Having said that, I think I'm back on the Chris Ivory bandwagon there. That sounds like a more safer train. Like, people go on Yelp and give that train good reviews when they ride it. So 5K, Chris Ivory this week?
Absolutely. I will say I've been on the Ivory bandwagon since before the season started. I do like him. I continue to like him. He's the clear lead option in the Jets, and they're committed to the run. It really helps them open up those bigger plays for Brandon Marshall or Decker.
All right, and the last running back I'm going to ask you before we move on here, position-wise, David Johnson, 4K on DraftKings at San Francisco. How much exposure should we have?
Well, he's been amazing. I would say if you want to have, I would say no more than 25% exposure to him, just because they haven't fully committed to him in a running back role. I know, the touchdowns have been there. The price is outstanding. I want to see, but to me, touchdowns are the hard thing to predict from week to week. Usage, to me, is the bigger indicator. So I just want to see a bigger commitment from the Cardinals. And can I add one more running back?
Sure.
I feel like I say him every week, but I'll say Joseph Randle again this week with probably Brandon Weeden under center for the Cowboys, though they just acquired Matt Castle. I think the reliance on the run game behind that offensive line should be their priority. And Atlanta has been one of the more generous run defenses that we've seen over the past, 18 to 20 games. So I will be fairly high in on Joseph Randle again this week.
Okay, sounds good. And I think that people who are concerned about Joseph Randle coming into the season, they can basically set aside those concerns for the most part. Yes, Lance Dunbar is a factor, but clearly they need a good dose of Joseph Randle for them to be successful. And I think it goes up an even bigger notch this week with Tony Romo out coming into week 3. So I feel very comfortable about Joseph Randle. All right, wide receivers here. Before we talk about the top tier, I want to talk about the guy who was an integral part of the $2 million winner here on DraftKings, and that's Travis Benjamin. As we mentioned here, top grade on the wide receiver cornerback chart. They are matched up against Nico Thorpe of the Oakland Raiders here. Higher grade than anybody else coming into week 3 here. What do we do with Travis Benjamin going into next week? Because it seems like a pretty risky boomer bust play.
It absolutely is. He found his way into one of my preseason articles in just that vein, the boomer bust, the big play guy. Like, he's a big play guy. If somebody's going to throw the ball 40, 50, 60 yards downfield, it's probably going to be at Travis Benjamin. And Josh McCown has a little bit of a propensity to throw the long ball when he's healthy. He clearly had nice rapport with Manziel. But I've said this to a couple of friends, I wouldn't be surprised if Travis Benjamin doesn't match his week 2 production for the rest of the season. It's just the kind of player that he is. He'll burst onto the scene, have this huge explosion of fantasy value, and then disappear. So it's not a play that I would put trust in. I'm not in season long, I'm not bidding, 80% of my fab on him. And again, it's something I'm willing to be wrong on, because this isn't Travis Benjamin's first time in the league. It's not his first big catch. And
my concern.
We don't know what's going to happen with the quarterback situation.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of factors up in the air. Here's my personal take on this. I'm pretty sure, I haven't looked at the line, but I'm pretty sure Cleveland's favored. I would guess it's -3, -4, something like that. Sorry, did you have that number in front of you by chance?
4.5.
Okay, 4.5. Perfect, makes sense. And I expect Cleveland to be up in a good part of that game, sort of similar to Tennessee. If they're playing from behind, that would be something different. But even when they've been super committed to the run, which is why you see something like Johnny Manziel having 15 total attempts passing, which is not good for anybody in the passing game. Even if, Travis Benjamin's going to have a few deep routes that are going to blow the top off of defenses there. If he doesn't hit on those passes, no one's talking about Travis Benjamin this week. It's just another guy who had 2 catches for 30 yards or something like that and happened to return a punt, which is great. But I don't think anybody's going to take that punt return and say, oh, you've got to play Travis Benjamin here in week 3. The only thing that makes it interesting for me is that he has a top projected grade on Pro Football Focus. So I'll buy in for a share or two, but I don't think I have to match him up with, I certainly don't actually want to match him up with Manziel, even if he gets to start, because I just don't feel like there's going to be enough passing attempts for it to make sense. So I'm going to take your Tyrod Taylor approach and say, when you don't have to use a cheap quarterback in that spot to match up with that cheap home run play option there. You can go with a higher projected floor with your quarterback in your other positions. So I'll take a few shares based on the grade, but I'm not going to go bonkers on it. All right, so let's talk about wide receiver options that make more sense here. Who should we lock into our lineups for week 3?
I'm sorry, you cut out for just a minute. What was it?
I was just asking, who should we lock in our lineups here for cash and GPPs for top options for wide receiver in week 3?
There's a few guys that I like. I like Jarvis Landry on volume alone. Miami playing at home. I like for Tannehill to probably have a decent week. I'm respectful of Buffalo's defense, but I think we've seen that. The Patriots clearly own Buffalo, but you can throw on them. You can move the ball downfield through the air, and if Miami's going to do that, it's going to be with Landry. I think depending on what happens with Decker, Brandon Marshall makes for a great option and probably a really high-scoring game at home with Philadelphia. His price is very, very affordable. I don't know what on FanDuel. He's like 6,200 on DraftKings.
74 on FanDuel.
74. It's fine. Edelman, always, we already mentioned him. Again, when he's healthy, Tom Brady's going to use him often. I think he leads the league in targets.
Yeah, you just happened to mention, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 2 more of the top 6 matchup grades in terms of plus advantage on the wide receiver cornerback chart.
Can I think for all 6? DeAndre Hopkins?
DeAndre Hopkins is not in the top 20 from what I can tell. Oh. So a little bit surprising here. But I like D-Hop. I think this is the week 2 sort of in the same vein to a lesser extent with Houston 0-2 going back at home in sort of a must-win game, and the fact that they can't run the ball. So I'll definitely have a good amount of DeAndre Hopkins, and I like the fact that he's priced in a similar tier to Brandon Marshall there as well. 7,800 on FanDuel for DeAndre Hopkins there as well. And just to add on, by the way, not that you needed more support for this, but Brandon Marshall and on DraftKings and on FanDuel, top 10 projection from our good buddy Jonathan Bales and company at Fantasy Labs there as well. So everybody loves Brandon Marshall this week, and I think he's going to be a solid wide receiver 2 cash game play. I'm going to try to take a shot at Antonio Brown, Julio, maybe Odell Beckham Jr. lock the top spot there. Then I'm going to tack on to that with Brandon Marshall as my wide receiver 2. All right, so let's talk about going deep here a little bit more. Allen Robinson at 6,600 is pretty interesting. It is New England. We know that they can be thrown on there as well. You saw Sammy Watkins catch a nice bomb in that matchup. Allen Robinson shares this week?
Absolutely. Plenty of them. I've already written about him a couple times.
Okay, great. Devontae Adams here, 6,400, similar tier. Got nicked up with an ankle injury, but came back in the game. Are we going to hold down the fort, or do we need to pivot elsewhere?
I'm going to monitor the health status there. Kansas City is a tough defense. I'm probably not buying too heavily into Green Bay outside of Randall Cobb. He's my most trusted option in that offense. So I probably won't reach for an Adams this week. There's other cheaper players that I like better.
All right. Let's talk about just some deep going super cheap value play down at the bottom of the barrel here at wide receiver before we move on.
Okay.
Who you got?
Oh, my bottom of the barrel guys, and we already mentioned Doug Baldwin. Mm-hmm. The other guy that I'm impressed with so far is Michael Crabtree. I know we mentioned Cleveland's pass defense is pretty, and Joe Hayden is maybe a little bit formidable, but Crabtree's getting a lot of looks. He's getting a lot of deep looks. That's the role that they brought him in for, to complement Amari Cooper, and he's been really successful at it. I think he has 15 targets through the first 2 games, and I think those looks are gonna continue. We also already mentioned Doug Baldwin, sorry. And one other, maybe Corey/Philly, whatever. I don't know how he's actually going by. I think officially Corey Brown, is another kind of bottom of the barrel guy that I'd look at this week at home against whatever New Orleans is.
that makeshift secondary that has gotten exposed multiple in back-to-back weeks there.
Quarterbacks. So.
Yeah, Pro Football Focus has him listed as Philly Brown, by the way, and he does have a positive grade against Damian Swan with 2 N's in New Orleans, by the way. And interesting that you brought up Michael Crabtree, because he is 1 spot ahead of Philly Brown on this list on the cornerback wide receiver chart there. Joe Hayden, by the way, has a -3 grade against Michael Crabtree here this week. So for all the hubbub of him being Mr. Shutdown, top 5 corner in the league, Pro Football Focus says don't have any problem rolling Michael Crabtree out in that lineup against him. So I think he becomes an interesting play. Let's move on to tight ends here. And it's interesting here what's happening at the top. I just want to put out a quick disclaimer here as well. If Jason Witten doesn't sit, I think for overall value, we've got to have a good amount of shares of Gavin Escobar. Are you with me here?
Sure. We saw Gavin Escobar start to get involved toward the end of last season. That touchdown didn't get called back in week 1. He had the touchdown. He had the end zone look at least in week 1. And if Jason Witten is out, I have to think he'll be involved. I have this kind of theory, and I don't know exactly the best way to go about proving it or supporting it with data, but that when you get a situation where a second-tier backup quarterback takes over, that he's often more comfortable with the backup position players. Like during practice, he's throwing, Brandon Weeden is practicing with Gavin Escobar while Tony Romo practices with Jason Witten. And there's that rapport and comfort level, I think, that comes from that. And I don't know how to prove it at all. It's just kind of a feeling or a theory that I have, but
I think there's good examples of that, by the way. Like Aaron Rodgers, he sat on the practice squad forever, and I think he was throwing to Jordy there before Jordy cracked the lineup, because Jordy was behind Greg Jennings and James Jones at the time before they moved on. And the next thing you know, Jordy's the number 1 and Aaron Rodgers is a starter. So I think it absolutely makes a ton of sense. And, Brandon Weeden has been with that team in that offense for a while, playing on the second team with Gavin Escobar. And combine that with the $2,600 price on DraftKings, must play if Witten sits. Now, having said that, Witten is a warrior who I think, what did he have like a broken rib or what it was? And it was like he was supposed to be out by week 4 and he played week 1. So it is 2 ankle injuries, 1 to both ankle and a knee. But having said that, I think you know that the sort of situation that the Cowboys are in, I think he's going to make every single effort to play. But put him in the James Starks category, right? We
absolutely
super high exposure if Jason Witten doesn't play.
Yep.
All right, so standard tight end plays for aside from the if or maybes there as well. Who can we anchor our teams with at the tight end?
I'm looking hard at a guy that I didn't buy into the hype at all last year, and has impressed me so far this year, and that's Eric Ebron. His price on DraftKings is $3,300. It's lower than anybody else that's come close to his production. He's actually scored exactly 15.3 fantasy points in each of the games, but he's getting a ton of targets. He's like, I don't want to be misquoted, but he's either leading or very close to leading the Lions in targets with 15. He has a touchdown in each of the games, which I've already said. That's something I find is a lot harder to predict, but a tight end that's getting those kind of looks and capitalizing on them is doing a lot to establish trust in the beginning of the season. And the price hasn't kept pace like it has with some of the other tight ends. I mean, we've seen a lot of tight ends go off and have great games, but he's one that's done it twice and the price has stayed in the basement.
I'm surprised too with 10 targets there and a score in back-to-back games. There hasn't been enough adjustment, and I like the fact that when you take a look at the Denver defense, which we know is fairly stout there as well, and they're probably going to do a pretty good job of at least trying to take away Calvin Johnson, who we know is the number one option. Then you have Golden Tate, then the running back situation there that leaves a lot of check down middle of the field, red zone potential opportunity as a secondary look for Eric Ebron, and he's cashed in 2 weeks in a row. I'm not predicting another touchdown, but I think based on the matchup, he makes a lot of sense. And for the fact that they haven't really price adjusted him too far above where he's been to open the season here as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Another guy in that same category, I think, is Charles Clay for the Buffalo Bills. He's kind of established that same kind of trust with Tyrod Taylor. He's a little bit cheaper, even $3,100, in probably a tougher matchup on the road in Miami. But he's another guy that I'll be using at least a little bit.
One of the guy I definitely want to take a look at here, I think that I'm have a good amount of shares in, is Greg Olsen here, matched up against New Orleans here in week 3. We saw the sort of target bounce back that people expected here in week 1, and the price adjusted down to $4,900 from $5,300 on DraftKings going into week 2. So it's down another $100 this week there. So $4,800 matched up against New Orleans, 14 targets for Greg Olsen, and he hasn't yet cashed in the end zone, but I think that he will eventually there as well. So I think he's a little bit off the radar, just a little bit from some of these other top options where we've seen, like, the Eric Ebrons, the Travis Kelce's, the Tyler Eiferts, who have made hay in the first couple of weeks of the season, and the Jason Wittens. So I don't think he'll be overowned, and I think he makes a great play, particularly on DraftKings for $4,800.
Agree. Tournaments only, because maybe there really is something wrong with him. Who knows? I mean, he's always been in my category of, he's got 3 touchdown potential and he's got 3-yard potential. So he's always going to be kind of a 0 to 25 fantasy point kind of guy. And, usually you don't get 2 terrible weeks in a row, but that's what we have. So, I mean, if you buy into the he's due narrative at all, Greg Olsen has to lead that train this week.
All right, it makes a good amount of sense for me there as well. All right, so let's go ahead and flip over to the defense here before we wrap this up here. Defense is tough this week in my mind. I felt like we had a few solid options, and how wrong we were, or at least I were last week with I think I got negative points from the Ravens there at Oakland, and St. Louis wasn't nearly as stout as we expected them to be against Washington here as well. Are there some safer defenses that you feel good about here coming back into week 3?
There's so many safe defenses this week, I feel like. I had a hard time coming up with contrarian picks to write about. Obviously, Seattle at home against Chicago is
top option.
Has every single thing in their favor. Mm-hmm. They're the obvious number one play. I don't care how many people own them. I'm going to own them a ton. Carolina against New Orleans if Luke McCown starts. I'm going to wish this was a week where you could roster defense in your flex, right?
Wow, so much disrespect for the McCowns. What happened to the I guess this is why I don't have a job with Mike Clay in the projections. Is I projected you for 50 shares of Luke McCown, and here you are trying to play a defense in the flex against him.
Trying to sully my name. Wow.
All right, so for me, Houston is interesting. I think they've underperformed as a defense. We haven't seen enough of the Jadeveon Clowney, J.J. Watt, firestorm that sort of people finally expected to come here in the first 2 weeks of the season. But they have a top projected point total here in the fantasy labs. Lineup optimizer here as well. Actually, slightly higher projected than Seattle. Is that right for you? Can we have some shares, or are you just going to sort of anchor with Seattle here?
I think Houston is fine. I don't think they outscore Seattle.
Okay, fair enough. Now, a bit off the radar here. One last play I want to give you before we go. Cleveland defense, which was actually a top tournament option there as well for you saw the people who are making their millions on FanDuel and Draftkings as well. Scored very well, beat up Marcus Mariota. They're 7 sacks. Actually had another interception called back on I think it was a illegal hands to the face. It was just like a non-penalty that didn't even matter for the play itself. And I don't want to say non-penalty, but just it wasn't like, oh, they got the interception because there was holding, and that prevented him from making the play there. So as well, for 2,900 on DraftKings there as well. Defense is always priced in sort of a close knit group here, but that's for given the top option being $3,400, $500 is a pretty big cost savings at the defense position. Does that make enough sense for you to have some shares again for those who went to the well in week 2?
Yep, they actually were who I came up with for my contrarian play. I said I had a hard time. They were one of the two that I came up with for my contrarian play. So I think they have upside there for sure. Oakland is a young team. They are bound to make mistakes. I think those mistakes are more likely to happen on the road, and that's what I build defense on is, the propensity to make mistakes. Others that stand out: New England, Philly, Denver to a lesser extent, cheap, but
yeah, Denver just $100 more than Detroit. And so if you feel good about, the playmakers on that defense, or you feel like you can maybe potentially trust them more because the Lions have struggled on the, for the first 2 weeks of the season, I'm probably going to try to have a few shares of Cleveland, some shares of Denver, and then anchored the majority of my cash with Seattle, and then I'll just create a little bit of extra exposure to Houston in case it all goes haywire. Then I'm not 100% exposed the way I was very close to between St. Louis and the Ravens last week. So don't want to try to make that same mistake twice. All right, that is going to wrap it up for today's show. Before we go, Renee, what's coming up for you here in week 3 this week?
I'm doing articles for FanDuel specifically. I'm writing on Roto World a bargain bin article and a contrarian plays article. For PFF, I'll be putting out my DraftKings plays on Friday. And at ESPN, I'll be writing a DraftKings specific flex article, whether you want safe, high upside, or value at your flex. I'll have options for you, as well as looking at the best games to target based on the Vegas lines. That'll be Friday.
All right, excellent. We'll make sure we check out all those works on Roto World, ESPN, and Pro Football Focus, among others. And for me, I'll have the next 2 episodes of the RotoWire DFS podcast, NFL plays, talking FanDuel specific, there for Wednesday and Thursday with both with Benny Ricciardi. So we'll split up the positions 3 and 3, and even give you some kicker plays there as well. So if you're looking for hot kicker analysis, make sure you check out the RotoWire DFS podcast on rotowire.com. And then you can also check out my Friday wide receiver and running back punt plays all season long here on Pro Football Focus every Friday afternoon / Saturday morning. So don't forget to subscribe to Pro Football Focus Radio on iTunes. You can listen on Stitcher and Blog Talk Radio, and watch the official Pro Football Focus YouTube channel and the Fantasy Sports Network. Thanks for watching and listening to today's show, brought to you by DraftKings.com, America's favorite one-week fantasy football site. And thanks as always to my co-host Renee Miller for joining me for her expert insight. Don't forget to follow her on Twitter at Renee Miller01, And you can send all your comments, complaints, questions to me at Josh Hayes FS. Thanks for watching and listening, and we'll see you here next week.